Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us this afternoon. This is Monica Morrison, and I am the founder of Texas Native Cats. We are an organization that provides education, outreach, and advocacy for our 5 species of native wild cats. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Karen Salcedo, who will introduce our guest speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I met Scott on Instagram. I started following him because he had some of the most amazing videos, camera trap videos, and Robert and I, some of you guys know that we do camera trap studies, and I just loved his content, and we just connected that way, and then I learned about all the research he'd been doing, and then saw his website and just was like, oh, we've got to have him speak to at one of our meetings. So that's how Scott came to be here. I will turn it over to Scott.
All right, thanks, Karen. And thank you, Monica and Texas Native Cats, for having me. My name is Scott Dubois, and I'm a writer and designer and naturalist from Austin. And while I'm here, and a big part of my research is I'm the creator of the website wildtexashistory.com. And on that website, I document historical wildlife encounters in Texas, primarily through primary source documents, newspapers, things like that, if I can find them. And I want to talk today a little bit about the history of the jaguar in Texas, particularly 20th century jaguars, which is really my main focus. And I also want to give you something a little bit more than just a timeline and some photos. So I'll probably talk a little bit about my research, some of my website, and why I think all of this is important. And then at the very end, like Monica said, I'll take some questions, and I have a few trivia kind of things if we have time. And also just to warn y'all, there's quite a few dead animal photos in my presentation, mostly because that's how wildlife was depicted historically. So let me share my screen real quick. Here's a jaguar painting by Audubon that's a little more animated and less dead than a lot of the photos I'll show, but like that to start off. So to get things started, just humor me a little bit. I'd like you guys to imagine taking a walk in the Texas prairie at sunset. So you'll see some live oaks, maybe some mesquite, bunch of grasses, blue stems, maybe a deer or two in the distance. And then you might spot some smaller animals like some javelina foraging around. I don't know if you guys can see the fade, but this was my attempt at special effects for a presentation. And then you see a massive herd of deer, maybe 20 or 30 animals grazing. And then an elk startles out of the brush. So these were once quite a bit more widespread in Texas. Now they're really relegated to ranches in the far west in the state, but used to be quite a bit more common. You can also imagine bison or pronghorn antelope in this place as well. And then you hear some warning calls of birds, and then you see a jaguar stalking in the margins. And this was Texas 300 years ago at the cusp of European colonization. So much larger and much more diverse biota than there is today. And this vision of Texas has totally enchanted me for a long time. And it really is what motivated me to seek more evidence of what Texas once was, particularly the jaguar. Just on a personal note, a lot of this hit home for me when I was traveling. This is South Africa, not Texas, but it really reminded me of Texas when I was there. And just watching the leopard, the impala, the kudu, for some reason, it allowed me to visualize what Texas might look like before there were mass killings of wildlife in the state. I really felt like I had inherited a denuded landscape. But through that feeling, our historic apex predator in Texas, the jaguar, became a symbol of a truly wild Texas in my mind. So just the dreams of jaguars roaming in my backyard 100 years ago just kept me up at night and really brought me to this point today. So to zoom out a little bit, I'm just share a map of the current and historic range of the jaguar. The darker part is the current range, which is much smaller than it is historically. You can see Texas and most of the Southwest is part of the jaguar's range. Now, what evidence do we have for this? If I can take a quick dip into some deep history, we do have the fossil record of jaguar in Texas. Jaguar has lived in Texas for a long time. They evolved in Eurasia actually, but crossed over Beringia across the land bridge into America thousands of years ago and have been here ever since. We have evidence of the jaguar in Texas in places like Shoals Cave in southwest Texas, where you have 10,000-year-old jaguar remains from the late Pleistocene era. And these were likely larger jaguars like Panthera augusta. You can see the legs are quite a bit longer in this description. And this cave also has remains of ancient humans and a variety of wildlife, so it's an interesting place. If you fast forward from the Pleistocenes, jaguars, unlike other cats in the Americas like saber-toothed cats or the American cheetah, survived, possibly by going to a smaller body type and being adaptable to the new conditions. So this is the modern jaguar we know today that you guys know. Documentation of the jaguar in Texas by humans is much more recent than these Pleistocene fossils, so only 7,000 years ago. This is Seminole Canyon. It's a wonderful state park in southwest Texas. And 7,000 years ago, the archaic people painted this Fate Bell cave with a variety of religious symbols and animals, etc. And they actually depicted spotted cats in this cave as well. And so this may be a little hard to see, so I'm going to use my pointer, but an organization out there called Shumla, who studies this cave art, used a scanning technique to find this. And you can see a head, a tongue, forepaws, rear paws, then there would be a tail, and this is a spotted cat in here. And this is right at the confluence of the Pecos and Rio Grande. If you head a little bit, well, actually quite a bit further west of the Pecos River, towards El Paso in Huecotenc State Park, you will also see more depictions of cats. The Mogollon people lived there about 900 years ago, and in two different caves, they drew these depictions of what are considered to be jaguars. Now, there's a lot I could cover in this period of Native American prehistory, but I focus more on the colonial and to modern era, so that's roughly 1700 to 2000. And why I've chosen that, it's a nice boundary for me to have for one, but it's also a more recent time period because jaguars were only extirpated in Texas in the 1940s. And there's a lot of documentation that I think can be collected on them. There are images of these big cats roaming our backyards that aren't that far gone. And I really want to help fill in these memories of people before they forget. So here's one of the oldest jaguar stories in this period I found. It's from Azoria County in East Texas in 1847. And this came from a very influential book for me, which was The Explorer's Texas by Del Winiger. And I'll cover that in a little bit, but I want to read you this little story. Colonel C of Texas told me that out on the Bernard River, while he was hunting coons with the friends, the dog treed something in an immense live oak, over which they made an unusual commotion. Being the youngest, it was his fate to climb the tree and get, as they thought, the coon down. The tree was directly on the riverbanks and its branches reached nearly across. He climbed the tree and crawled out onto one of those horizontal limbs. Expecting every moment to see the coon, what should present itself, upon his rising up to look around, but an immense spotted tiger with eyes like balls of fire. What to do was the question. He could not back out. He dared not drop into the river, for it was full of alligators. He fell upon his plan. He swung himself below the limb and hung on by his hands. The tiger walked over him, descended the tree, and went through a crowd of 9 dogs, as fierce ones as that were in Texas, which never even growled at him. So very dramatic, tall tale of a jaguar, or not necessarily a tall tale because we do have confirmation that these people were in the area at the time. And I love it because it's unique. For one thing, the jaguar lives, which isn't as lucky in many of these other stories. And it also introduces you to some complications when researching Texas jaguars. They're called many things. Here it was called a tiger. They're also called Texas tiger, Mexican tigers, Mexican leopards. When you're looking around, you'll see other things like leopard cat and tiger cat, but those were more often used for ocelots. As I mentioned, The Explorer's Texas, I highly recommend this book to anyone who's interested in Texas history and wildlife because it paints a beautiful picture of Texas wildlife in the explorers period, and it's all done from reliable first-person accounts of early European explorers. You'll also, beyond the jaguar, see things about bison, elk, and antelope, and it gives you a good idea of the range of jaguars at the time. So Reading about jaguars in this book made me wonder what the last jaguar in Texas was. And so that question ultimately led to most of my research and to my website, Wild Texas History. If you Google the last jaguar in Texas, you'll often get an article from the Brownsville Herald. And if you're into wildcats, you may have seen this, but this is a jaguar killed in the Rio Grande Valley in 1946. It had been killing livestock in the area and was pursued by dogs and killed by some of the ranch hands, which is pictured here. The article's called The Last Jaguar, but it actually wasn't the last jaguar in Texas. It was the last one documented in the Rio Grande Valley. It mentions a jaguar killed in Kingsville two years later that was the actual last jaguar in Texas, and makes mention of an article in Texas Game and Fish magazine, which was the inspiration for this article. So I thought the best thing to do to find out more would look up that original magazine article, because I had to know more about this Kingsville jaguar. I grew up in Corpus Christi, and just imagining that cat so close to home really motivated me. So I took my inquiry to the Briscoe Center. This is at the University of Texas in Austin, a great resource for a lot of Americana collections, and they also have a cool collection of Texas Game and Fish magazine, which was the precursor to the Texas Parks and Wildlife magazine. It was run by the Texas Game, Fish, and Oyster Commission before it became the Parks and Wildlife Department. And in that collection, it was fairly easy going to March 1946 to find the article I was looking for, called the South Texas Big Game Hunt. You get the same photo that you would have seen in the Brownsville Herald article, but also a more detailed description of the hunt itself. Also, these magazines have fantastic covers, so I hope to collect all of those someday and post them on my website. While I was looking this up, there's a lot of other great content in there that I started finding. So this is about antelope restoration in West Texas, and a lot of this I ended up putting on my website, but I couldn't find any information about the last jaguar in Texas, nothing in 1948 or any of the successive years. Just a quick note, this was pretty cool. This was, I believe, in 46, but it shows the range of the ocelot in Texas, which is much different than it is today on maps that you'll see of the ocelot habitat. In its issue from later that year, there was also an article on the Goldthwait jaguar. This was a jaguar killed in Goldthwait, Texas in 1903. Goldthwait is up near Lampasas in the Northern Hill Country and was the northernmost jaguar recorded in Texas. So it has an interesting story of the jaguar here. Here's another photo of that jaguar. This is a higher quality of the hunters outside the Mills County Courthouse. It was a large male jaguar that was hunted down by dogs over the course of what sounds like an entire day, wounded a couple of dogs and one of the horses of the hunters. And other people are sometimes familiar with this jaguar as well. It's included in important Texas history documents like the Biological Survey of Texas. This is by Vernon Bailey from 1905. And it details the description of the distribution of animals throughout Texas at the time, and it includes some correspondence about the encounter with the Goldthwait cat. And this is available for download on my website if you're interested in these primary source materials beyond jaguars. It has all the Texas cats listed in here and reports from people. But at this point, I still hadn't found that last jaguar. It kind of hit a dead end at the Briscoe Center and decided to sign up for newspapers.com, and I've ended up using newspapers.com quite a bit. If you haven't used it and are interested in history, it's a really great resource. It was made for genealogists searching for obituaries and things like that, but there's a ton of other information that you can do a text search on. So I went to 1948, and it was really easy to find in the Collar Times. There was an article, tough customer, 121-pound jaguar killed on a farm near Kingsville. This was page 6 of the Collar Times of about a day after it happened. And this jaguar was killed by a farmhand on a dairy farm just a little bit south of Kingsville, which I found was in what I think is Dick Clayburgh Park. And you can see some of the language, like the other jaguar story, is a little bit dramatic. Back in the day, South Texas has everything, even jaguars. But there's one less Jaguar in this area now after Richard Cuevas, workers on the Bob Ferguson dairy farm near Kingsville, killed one of the big cats recently. And there was also a fairly dramatic photo to go along with this. This is the Jaguar, which is kind of hard to see in this reproduction. Everything's from microfilm, so it doesn't have quite the quality that you would like. And then the farmer's daughter sitting on top of the cat. It says Beauty and the Beast here. And if you start looking at historical cat photos, you find a theme. People, for some reason, like to pose small girls on a cat. It's kind of a weird thing that people are doing at the time, but it's common to see that. So as I mentioned, I'm from Corpus. This wasn't enough for me. You could barely see the cat. I didn't know much about it at the time. My grandmother, once I found this, realized that my grandmother only grew up like 10 or 15 minutes away. So just thinking that my family was there and a Jaguar may have been stalking in the bushes right out around her house would just captivated me. So I needed to learn more and saw this photo, and the autopsy of the Jaguar was done by Valjean Lemon, who I came to find was a biologist at the King Ranch, actually one of the first biologists and ecologists employed by a major ranch. He did quite a bit of work there on the quail population and range management, and there's quite a bit of interesting info on him if you'd like to look him up, and may have heard of him if you're into quail and hunting. But funnily enough, I ended up back at the Briscoe Center because they have a collection of Valjean Lemon's papers. I requested about 10 boxes of his files and went through a ton of them to find what I was looking for. It's quite a bit of activity reports, how many coyotes killed, how many quails nests, etc. But in the last box, maybe the first file in the last box I went to was this file. And this totally gave me chills. It's a great part about research when you find exactly what you're looking for. Jaguar, April 1948. And inside the file, there's quite a few more pictures of the Kingsville Jaguar with the farm workers, the farmer, his daughter, and on its own. There's also Layman's original autopsy here. You can see, I think this is kind of a funny line here, but it's a male cat, weighs 120 pounds, fat as butter. Just imagining him putting that in there. Gives details about how it was killed, and also mentions that it had a raccoon in its stomach and some fleas and ticks and goat wheat seed on it. These photos, beyond just the sheet here with a couple of small steps, there was the original negatives included. So you could get a really high quality view of what this cat looked like. And here's the farmer's son outside their house with the Jaguar in what looks like the Kingsville suburbs. And this photo really left a big impression on me. Part of it just because of how domestic the scene looks with the children playing in the background and the cars. And then there's this huge cat that the son is pulling up. And I just think about whether they knew if this was the last Jaguar in Texas. You wouldn't imagine so. I mean, this was on page 6 of the Caller Times, and most of these photos were never published. And at the time, jaguars and mountain lions and things like that would be shot on sight anyway. So I don't know that they thought much about it, but this really left an impression on me because it's the last Jaguar that roamed freely in the state. But imagine this one, it was a male, so it was probably coming up from the valley looking for new territory. And this is where it ended up. So after that, I had to find more about this. It kind of became an obsession because I had learned so many interesting things along the way, and I didn't want to just have this story about the Kingsville Jaguar and leave it at that. So I decided I wanted to document every Jaguar I could find that was ever documented in Texas. I combed through newspapers, books, And ultimately, as you can see on my website, have documented around 15 jaguars reported since around 1850. I don't have time to go through all 15 of these cats here, but I do want to highlight a few of them. And also, if you go to my website and see this presentation and you know of more jaguars that I'm not familiar with, I'd love to know about them, because I really want this to be a resource for people. I've laid out all of my research and how I found it, because I feel like it really gives life to some of these stories and some of these range maps that you see, a formal range of Texas, but this gives you a feeling of these cats actually living in Texas. So I'm just going to go over a couple of interesting jaguars that I found along the way that haven't been reported much in the books that I've seen. The first one is the San Antonio jaguar. This is, from what I can tell, around 1860. There was an interview done in the San Antonio Express with Gustav Derler, who was a prominent San Antonian, I should say. He was the manager of San Pedro Springs Park, also the fire chief, and held a few other positions in the town. So read his recollection to you at the time. This was probably in his boyhood, but it's really difficult to think of all these things consecutively. I recall 2 incidents of my boyhood I should have thought of before. While we lived at San Pedro Springs Park, I recall that my father shot from the window of our home one of the largest bucks I've ever seen. Another morning, as my brother and I started to school, we walked under one of the park trees and saw an immense wild animal spread out on a big limb, staring at us and showing his fangs. We didn't know what it was, but we did know it wasn't safe to let a thing like that run wild in our neighborhood. We yelled for Father to come with his gun, and he ran to us. It required 2 shots at close range to end the animal, which proved to be one of the largest jaguars ever seen anywhere in South Texas. Father skinned him, and an admirer of hides paid him $25 for the fur. That was a big sum in those days. So I love to imagine jaguars roaming in San Antonio. Here's the San Pedro Springs Park in 1869, probably a few years later after the described incident. If you've been to San Antonio, this is pretty close to downtown now, but at the time it was on the outskirts of town. So only jaguars in San Antonio nowadays are at the zoo. If you head a little bit northwest and move up into the 20th century, this is a jaguar that was mentioned in the Junction Herald and a few different articles about a jaguar killed in London, Texas, which is just a little bit west of Junction. It's interesting too, this is 1909, so this is just 6 years after the jaguar was killed in Goldthwaite. And reads a little bit like a Hardy Boys story, except there's some jaguar hunting involved. But just a little bit of it here. Pa and Charlie were scared to death. They had never seen a jaguar and didn't even know what it was they were seeing. They decided they better run for their own lives and try to get help as fast as their legs could carry them. And they did find help. There were a couple of farmers nearby with guns, and the townspeople took quite a few pictures with them. So you can see some close-up pictures with the dogs and the jaguar itself killed here, which are pretty striking. It's interesting thinking about how these cats got into Texas, because many of them may have been wiped out at this point, but this is right up the Llano River, so I can imagine them coming up that way. Also the Pecos River moving up there. I say that because there was one mentioned just a few years later further west near Ozona. This was barely reported at the time in 1915, but there's a story from the Victoria Daily Advocate that mentions it. It's clear they're talking about jaguars here and not anything else like an ocelot, even though the title was Huge Spotted Leopard Trapped in Ozona. And we know that here, and I'll read this a little bit here. It's pretty fascinating. But the mystery of the slaughter of the full-grown sheep in the suburbs of Ozona has been solved. While the ordinary leopard cats are numerous in this section, the regular South American leopard is rarely ever encountered north of the Rio Grande. So this, while the ordinary leopard cats are numerous in this section, so this means that ordinary old ocelots are pretty numerous here. I've seen it, but rarely ever see a jaguar. So this is something to write about, and I'm interested in ocelot too. So I thought that was pretty incredible. There was another tiny note about this around the same time in the Corpus Christi Caller. Ozona, Texas reports the trapping of a huge jaguar, probably a refugee from Mexico. And put this here just to note some of the language used in this. A lot of these articles use xenophobic language or when related to the jaguar. So no one really considers it a native Texas cat, even though they're reported all over the state historically, and at one time, while still rare, we're definitely around in Texas and could be considered a native cat. And so it was interesting, as I mentioned, the range of these cats. I mapped out all of these stories I could find here, starting with Kingsville in 1948 and going back. And there's clear coverage of the state, and it mirrors pretty closely what we have on some of these other jaguar maps that you'll see in books. So it's clear they once had a home here. This was only really a 100-year period that I found, so there's got to be a lot more that are out there that we're not seeing. And so I think all this is really fascinating historically, but what can we do with this information about jaguars? And this is a jaguar photo I took at the San Antonio Zoo. But I'm personally really worried that with every generation that goes by in our state, our ecological baselines are changing. So things that were once given that people were familiar with, like herds of bison and wild jaguars, are barely remembered by people today. Many people wouldn't know that jaguars are a native cat. This photo from the zoo, the exhibit that was next to the jaguar didn't include Texas on the map of range and didn't mention that this cat might have been found in the exact spot where the zoo was hundreds of years ago. And that was just a real illustration of that changing baseline for me, and really moved me, because when we forget what we have, how can we imagine our possibilities for the future? I feel like it really limits us. Here's another Audubon painting that I liked, and this is of an ocelot. And, you know, I think it's important to remember this wildlife and this wildness in Texas, because there's still spotted cats in the state we need to protect. You know, I don't want to see ocelots relegated to history books as an extirpated Texas species, because we've been just as hard on them as we have been on jaguars. So hopefully knowing this jaguar story and understanding our past can help us see that. I have turned up quite a bit of information on ocelots while I've been researching jaguars. You know, as you saw on the other map, there is a pretty decent coverage of the state where right now they're only relegated to far South Texas. But they mirror the jaguar range almost completely here. Just as you see pretty much from northern Mexico to the Pantanal, these spotted cats are living in similar habitats. And then here's a pretty sobering photo I found that illustrates a bit of that. This is from a Willacy County newspaper in the 1940s, which is in South Texas. These are 3 of Texas remaining wild cats, all killed at the same time. You've got an ocelot, a mountain lion, and a bobcat here. And this is just a really sobering photo for me to look at. It's a little bit difficult to look at. And this was actually taken at El Sal's Ranch, which is a large ranch in South Texas. There's also another close-up. This was from a different source, but another ocelot at El Sal's Ranch. As you can see, this can be a really sad topic to research, but hopefully it will bear some fruit. And Just to end on a more positive note, thankfully, this ranch in particular is doing work to actually preserve ocelot habitat today. You may have seen this camera trap photo by the Fin and Fur documentary team. This is an ocelot in South Texas, and they documented quite a few ocelots living at Ocelot's Ranch today. So I think we can change history. We can turn things around. It doesn't have to be the way it used to be, and we need to just familiarize ourselves with this to change. Now, I'm not saying these ocelots aren't still under threat. Habitat pressures and development are still huge hurdles to overcome for them. But I do think we have space for ocelots and big cats in Texas if we're willing to share. We could protect large swaths of habitat. This is near Colorado Bend. And from what I've seen in history, ocelots used to roam this area just like jaguar. And I think we can protect large swaths of habitat. Texas has really minimal public lands, which can be expanded. I think Prop 5 that passed last year to give more money to parks and wildlife was a good start, but we really need to demand more. I think we also need to grow the number of conservation-minded ranchers in Texas and also homeowners so they can create homes for wildlife around them. There are those private ranches like El Sal's are doing conservation work, and I think there could be a lot more ranchers doing the same thing. And of course, I think part of getting there is being in better touch with our history and these stories. People need to imagine how wild Texas once was to imagine how wild it could be again. You know, if we don't remember what we have, how can we ever get it back? So this is a museum exhibit I designed while I was doing my website and some of these research. It's kind of a long-term goal for me to hopefully educate more people about the jaguar in Texas. You can even see there's a skull of the gold-thwait jaguar here, which is in the archives at the Smithsonian, and maybe we could get it back to Texas someday to show off again. In the meantime, I still have a website, as I mentioned, wildtexashistory.com. You can go there for more information on the jaguars that I've mentioned. There's as much documentation as I could find on each one that you can read about here, and also a host of other stories about jaguarundi, mountain lion, fish, bear, etc. And here's me on that same trip to Kruger. And as I mentioned, my website is wildtexashistory.com. And you can also see a little bit more about me and my portfolio, some of the other projects I've worked on at scottdub.com. And then on Instagram, as Karen mentioned, you can follow me at ATX Wildlife if you're interested in backyard wildlife. So I think I'm going to pause for a little bit and see if we have questions. And if there aren't any, or we have a little bit more time, I kind of have some fun facts I think I could share. Check the chat window.
Yeah, Robert just posted one.
Okay. So Robert asked, with potential human interaction and fragmented habitat notwithstanding, would jags be able to thrive now in South Texas? If so, and with North Texas getting warmer due to climate change, could they thrive further north? That's a great question. I wish I was more of a biologist to be able to answer that with some clarity, but I do think that they could thrive in South Texas, but it's going to be a long road to that point. We do, Texas has recovered species like deer and javelina that were prey species for jaguar, and the habitat still is ideal for them. But as you mentioned, it's fragmented. There's ranchers, there's population centers. So it's a really complicated puzzle to get that done. I would have more hope for the ocelot. I think they're less threatening. You might even call them cute if someone saw them walking in the woods. I don't think you'd have the same impression as you had with the jaguar. So I don't think it's out of the question. You still have jaguar populations in Tamaulipas, in northern Mexico, also in Sonora, Mexico, which is a different jaguar population. But the cats are there. It's just a matter of getting them here, protecting them. We have border issues as well with the border wall. So I'd say long term, there's hope, but it's going to take a lot of work. As far as North Texas getting warmer, I guess it depends a little bit on the habitat and how that changes. I think if it's warmer and you don't have as cold of winters, they could probably live there, but you have a lot of plains in that area, and I don't think the jaguar would love living on the plains. But if rainfall changed along with this warmer weather, there's probably a possibility there. Okay, what's the mechanism for getting more public land in Texas? Is that accomplished through the state simply or not so simply purchasing land from private ranchers? From what I understand, it's a fairly convoluted process. We haven't had too many state parks recently, although there are some on the horizon. A lot of this land can be donated to the state. Ranches like Big Red Ranch used to be in private hands and are now state parks. So those can be transferred, but it has to be a little bit of a juggling act because you can give land directly to the state, but if there's no money there to support maintenance, etc., it becomes difficult for them to maintain, and they're not likely to turn that into any sort of state parks. But yes, expanding lands, I think private ranchers, if you can collect money, there are organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, et cetera, that are acquiring land to do this and protect it. So it is possible, even if it's not a state park, that it is protected. Private ranchers can also create conservation easements to avoid their land being broken up into ranchettes or being developed in the future. So I think, especially in Texas, the private ranch angle is really big for conservation because we're such a private property oriented state. So if you look at organizations like the East Foundation working with Alsal's Ranch might be a place to look and how they're doing conservation on these private ranches. How can conservationists work with ranchers and their organizations to show the benefits of bringing back these cats? I think it's going to be a little bit of a process, but as you saw, there was that photo of the ocelot that Fin and Fur took, and they're producing, if you haven't seen it, I would check it out. There is a film they're making called Deep in the Heart about Texas wildlife. And I think there's a lot of education that can be done there about what these species are, how they're not going to disrupt what you're doing, and have a general public sentiment to really engage people around them. If you're just a rancher out on your own and you happen to see an ocelot, there's been so much misinformation and fear around the Endangered Species Act that people don't want them around and may just kill them and bury them. So I think organizations, like Texas Native Cats and other people continuing to have this conversation and engaging ranchers, I think is an important part. Are land trusts run by the state or nonprofits? Most of the land trusts are nonprofits, so you have things like Nature Conservancy, et cetera, managing these land trusts. There's a variety of them that manage conservation easements that work in conjunction with the state sometimes. Okay, Joan says, can you contrast mountain lions against jaguars regarding how they survive, but jaguars do not? For one, mountain lions, I think, have historically always been more numerous in the state, so there were a lot more to kill off, but also mountain lions are a little bit more adaptable than jaguars. Mountain lions live all across the United States in cold habitats to desert habitats, whereas jaguars have a little bit more of a niche ecological element. So, and then also, I think just their fur is a valuable trade item. So I'll get to some of that maybe if we have time, but you see jaguar skin vests and clothing and chaps and things like that in Texas historically, so there's definitely an incentive to kill them. Let's see, there's a present, okay. Jones says there's a present bill in Congress to expand Big Bend National Park proposed by Will Hurd. I will have to look that up. I know there's a bunch of large ranches for sale in that area now that are 70,000 acres, so that would be fantastic if that could be expanded. Many Texas ranchers are now building endangered species from Africa. Has there been a focus for the same for Texas species with education? I think that's really interesting and something that, as I mentioned, when I was in Africa, I noticed, and you come back to Texas and you drive around and you see oryx and wildebeests. So there's definitely ranchers in Texas that are proud to have exotics, but there hasn't been quite the same enthusiasm for native Texas species. I think a lot of these are being hunted, so that's part of it. Although ranches like Bamberger Ranch in the Hill Country here are raising scimitar horned oryx, which are endangered in Africa, and the terrain and the habitat is very similar to theirs, so it works well for that. But other species in Texas, like are a little bit more of a difficult sell. I do think, elk and bison are slowly making a comeback through these private ranches. Jones says Hurd's bill is H.R. 8093 if anyone wants to look up that bill to expand Big Bend National Park. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. I really appreciate everyone coming and listening to me. And thanks for Texas Native Cats. I think I'll just end with a couple of interesting little tidbits. I've got a lot more information that I didn't want to bog you guys down with, but always found this fun. This is Sam Houston and his Jaguar skin vest. Fun fashion fact, it was given to him by the Cherokee we spent a lot of time with out east. And this may or may not have been from Texas. There was trade throughout the Americas through Mexico and the Southwest by the Native Americans, but it was a valuable trade object at the time and really a token of honor that they gave it to him. He was fond of saying, the leopard doesn't change its spots, so he doesn't change how he feels about an issue. He didn't really realize it was a jaguar. He thought it was a leopard, but you can tell it's jaguar because of the spot within the rosette here. And he said this in particular was famous for saying that around the Civil War because he was never a supporter of the Confederacy and he claimed never to change his spots and was kind of pushed out of Austin for that somewhat. And then one last little note, if anyone's from Corpus like me, I thought this was super fascinating, but Colonel Kenny, who founded Corpus, was a bit of a scoundrel, but appeared to love wildlife. And so he named quite a few of the Corpus Christi downtown streets after native Texas wildlife. So if you're in Corpus, you see a Buffalo Street, Antelope Street, Chaparral Street, Mesquite Street. And then you have Leopard Street, which I always wondered about as a kid. And thought it could be a jaguar, but I'm pretty sure Leopard Street refers to the leopard cat and the ocelot that they would have seen in Corpus at the time. And I was bummed that, okay, well, there's maybe not a Jaguar Street, but if you look at an old map, you'll see a Tiger Street. So if we take that pattern from Texas, we can imagine he's probably talking about a Texas tiger here. So thought that was fun. But anyway, I will end on that and put my information back up. And thanks so much for you guys coming out. And I think Monica may take over from here.
Thank you, Scott. This was absolutely fascinating. And as you and I were talking the other night on the phone about all this, and I think you said it so well, if we don't recall the history that we have, how can we hope to ever return to where we were, particularly in terms of wildlife. And I think that's very important to see just the absolutely amazing array of wildlife that existed in this state and how it's been so reduced to current standards. So thank you for that. Very, very interesting presentation. I hope everybody has enjoyed it tonight, and we appreciate it. Scott, we have a small gift that's relevant to the topic. I'll say that. Now you have to wait. Now you're excited. You can hardly wait for the mail to show up. I know. Anyway, that should be coming to you with our greatest appreciation for your presentation tonight. So thank you. If nobody else has any other questions, I think we will adjourn for now.